This program overlaps with two large-scale initiatives of the Minnesota Historical Society, one to engage the public in dialogue about the U.S. Dakota War of 1862, and the other to re-examine our understanding of the American Civil War. And of course, the historical figure who binds these two subjects together is President Abraham Lincoln, our focus today. Every president from George Washington to Barack Obama has had or made an attempt to have an Indian policy. Abraham Lincoln was no exception. In two instances, his policy toward American Indians, or lack thereof, intersected with his prosecution of the Civil War, and with disastrous results. His seeming indecision and inattention to Indian territory had long-lasting negative consequences for the peoples of the 5 civilized tribes. And then there's the case of the Dakota of Minnesota. In early 1862, a federal investigator named George Day cautioned President Lincoln that mass corruption within Minnesota's system of Indian agencies would lead to disaster if left unchecked. The president never acknowledged that warning. When the U.S. Dakota War broke out 8 months later, Lincoln told Minnesota Governor Alexander Ramsey, "Attend to the Indians. Necessity knows no law." In light of the war's terrible aftermath, it was a statement Lincoln would come to regret. Here today to aid our examination of Lincoln's Indian policy and his role in the U.S. Dakota War in particular is Dr. David Nichols, historian, author, and the former academic dean at Southwestern College in Winfield, Kansas. Dr. Nichols has spoken across the nation at venues including the Clinton Presidential Library, the Eisenhower Library, Atlanta History Center, John F. Kennedy Library, the Air Force Academy, and the National Archives. In 1978, the University of Missouri Press published his book, Lincoln and the Indians, Civil War Policy and Politics. That book remains the definitive study of Lincoln's Indian policy during the Civil War. The Minnesota Historical Society Press was honored to reissue Lincoln and the Indians last year, and the Minnesota History Center is equally honored to welcome him to the History Forum. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. David Nichols.
Thank you, Danielle. Good morning. You're awake out there. Okay, good. I just must say, you've got this wonderful program here that has so much good information in it that if you don't want to listen to the speech, you can read the program. Danielle put this together. It's superbly done, and I commend that. And it fits with my experience with the Minnesota Historical Society out of this. And please, if any of you know Steve Elliott or Ann Regan, to pass these thoughts on to them, or maybe I'll see them before the day is out. I deal regularly, actually, this will confuse you. I'm an Eisenhower expert now in my old age, and I deal regularly with Simon & Schuster, a major New York publisher, and I have to tell you, I have encountered no place and no personnel more professional than what you have right here. And you should be proud of your historical society. And also, I know you are, that's why you're here at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning. I think that's just wonderful. I should also mention Sheldon Wolfchild, who, among others, rediscovered this book of mine. This book that folks, I wrote roughly 40 years ago when I was 5. You know, I was a precocious child. And if you believe that, well, you won't believe much else what I say. But Sheldon called and wanted to put me as a talking head in his documentary, which I did, which if you haven't seen it, you should. I would urge you to see it. If it hasn't been shown here, I hope you will do that. That's not up to me, of course. But that contact touched me deeply, so this is for this old historian, kind of an exercise in nostalgia. When I say it was written 40 years ago, though, if you pick up the book, you'll see a blurb on it from the back from James McPherson, who is our greatest living Civil War historian. And if Jim McPherson says it's still okay, it's still okay. I assure you. So that makes me feel good. I got a message from email this morning from a recovering alcoholic friend down in Kansas, who, learning I was in Minnesota, said he'd once heard a presentation by a codependency counselor, I assume about alcohol, a codependency counselor from Minnesota, and that counselor said that in Minnesota, folks are cold, C-O-L-D, cold dependent. And I'm glad you haven't had any cold. I understand it's coming sometime today, but anyway, that's all right. I spent 18 years in South Dakota, and so I know that's the deep South to you folks. But I know that I know about snow and ice. And when I brought my first son home 100 years ago or so, we had 3 feet of snow on the ground. I still remember that. And since there's not much recreation in South Dakota, we'd come to the Twin Cities to do the Guthrie Theater and things like that. So a couple of disclaimers. First, my work is not military history. It's politics. And the title of the book says it well. It's the politics of Indian affairs. Second, this is a white man's history of that politics. I do not pretend to describe events from the perspectives of the natives. I will slide into using the names of the tribes, such as the Sioux and the Cheyenne, that were used by white leaders in that day. As historians, I'm sorry, we try to be accurate. We don't go back and do politically correct stuff with the quotations. But also, I'm a little out of date, so forgive me if I do know the modern names and the names that are more acceptable, but we don't inflict them on quotations from the past, and I'll share a number of quotations with you. When you read the book, we did not rewrite the book. We wrote a new preface, and Ann Regan very skillfully edited that for me, so the preface is new, but I'll stand by what's in the book, and I think people tell me it's still very readable. The good historians, though, just don't go back and change the wording. I'm sorry, that's controversial in many quarters these days. But no one, and certainly not me, can deny the absolutely corrupt, brutal treatment of Native Americans in this story. But it's essentially a story about Lincoln and its politics. Now, for more details about the Minnesota War itself, what happened on the ground, what happened in the conflict and the fighting, I commend you to Mark Dietrich's work. And there's a new book by Scott W. Berg, B-E-R-G, out that has a lot of information about that. I barely got to read that on the plane as an ebook coming back because it's brand new. But finally, if you want to know more about the politics of Indian affairs in the Lincoln years, get the book. I guarantee the book is better than my speech, okay? All right. It was August 21st, 1862. For Abraham Lincoln, the war with the South was not going well. Lincoln's armies were desperate for manpower, and it appeared at that moment that Lincoln might even have difficulty defending Washington against a Confederate attack. Lee's forces were within shouting distance of the capital. Then he got a telegram from the governor of Minnesota, Alexander Ramsey. Quote, "The Sioux Indians on our western border have risen and are murdering men, women, and children. Possibly 500 whites had died," that message said. And Alexander Ramsey demanded what Lincoln feared the most, that the president extend the draft deadline for Minnesota's quota of 5,360 men. Lincoln's response was harsh. "Attend to the Indians," he said. If the draft cannot proceed, of course it will not proceed. Necessity knows no law. That's the side of Abraham Lincoln that we all come to know. It's not all he is. He's the sensitive soul that I still get tears in my eyes reading the Gettysburg Address. The guy was a poet, and he had a magnificent ability to empathize with suffering, even on both sides. But at this moment, Lincoln the commander, remarkable for where he came from. The government cannot extend the time. He said, now, looking backward, I wrote this book originally because I said to myself, and there's an opening line in the book that says, surely Lincoln did not have time for Indians. Well, he had to make time. And of course, we've read backwards what we think is the importance of Indian affairs, when in fact, particularly in the West, it was central to the politics and even the financial situations of the time. And if you want to know how pervasive Native American history is, just look at the names that you all live with. The names of counties and cities and states. They're all around you, and that's the tip of an iceberg, because in fact, the interaction between whites and Indians was monumental in that history. And so we always tend to not get back inside what things were really like then. So I want to try to help you to do that this morning with 4 stories. 4 stories. First, the story of the so-called Indian system, as it was called in those days, for it's at the core of the entire situation. Probably the most definitive part of my book that still is really up to date. The second story is the story of the alliance of the tribes in the Indian Territory with the Confederacy and the resulting mess in my native state of Kansas. I know you're more interested in Minnesota than Kansas, but I have to do my Kansas thing for you, and it'll put Minnesota in a bit of perspective. The third story is the story, obviously, the Minnesota-Dakota Indian War, or United States-Dakota Indian War, as people are calling it more and more, and the proposed executions when that was over. And finally, a story about Lincoln's interaction with the reformers, the men and women who attempted to transform the incredibly corrupt Indian system. Well, the fundamental story, as I said, is the story of the Indian system. It's the root of all else in this saga of Lincoln and the Indians. And the structure of the Indian system revolved around treaties, that process inherited from the British where we treated native tribes as independent nations. And so you negotiate a treaty, usually after a war, or as some process for removing natives from the lands that whites wanted. And these treaties provided almost inevitably for government annuities in compensation for the land. Money, lots of money in Washington. Those funds were supposed to be there to care for the Indians because in most cases we moved them to some place where they couldn't care for themselves, where there wasn't good game, there wasn't good farmland, and so that money was to be compensation for them. And that fund was, and so the Indian system revolved around the strategies that whites developed for tapping these government monies. Well, folks, if you think entitlements is something new, you just don't know American history. You know, money in politics is pervasive throughout our history. And it's not something brand new at all, and this will demonstrate that to you. So 4 kinds of people could tap the money that was in Washington. Citizens could make claims for Indian deportations, and if the Indian agent approved it, they usually got it. Contractors were to provide goods and services for these usually dependent tribes who couldn't provide for themselves. Licensed traders on the reservations, traders provided retail outlets for goods, cost of which were charged to annuities, and at the center of the political system was the Indian agent. Now, all Indian officials, including agents, were political appointees. Needless to say, they were all white guys, white males. Claims, contracts, and traders' licenses needed the agent's approval. Traders were often, more than not, the relatives of the agent. And agents, through kickbacks and partnerships, could become very wealthy men. Now, Lincoln had his own part in this. The Secretary of the Interior and the Commissioner of Indian Affairs were people who administered. William P. Dole was the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, and he was an Illinois political crony, I think a cousin of Lincoln. But I would emphasize to you, there was so much money to be made out of this system. And congressmen generally, for the Indian agent appointments and the other appointments, they deferred to the congressmen and especially the senators. Now, corruption stories abounded. Even the political appointees turned in reports that I read back when about those corruption stories. In Oregon, an 1859 report charged that one agent on a $1,000 a year salary, $1,000, retired after 2 years with $17,000. You can do that math. Another accumulated $41,000 in 3 years on a $1,000 salary. An investigator in Minnesota, George H. Date, charged that a superintendent spent $100,000 to $200,000 on a $2,000 salary. Now remember, these are 1860s, 1850s, 1860s dollars. It's a lot of money. Agent Walter Burley in Dakota Territory was accused of using government funds to transport his own goods, hire his daughter to teach at a non-existent school, buy farm implements that no one could locate, and hire men to work at half the price Burley reported to the government. Despite that scandal, Burley was not relieved of his job, and in a perfect embodiment of how the Indian system worked, he eventually was elected as a territorial delegate to Congress. One agent, allegedly, stole $870,000 in bonds out of a safe in the Interior Department. Adjusted for inflation, that's worth about $20 million now. And this was a system, money and power. I used to have a counselor who said to me, money, sex, and power are interchangeable in Washington. I think probably in Minnesota too, but I don't know for sure. But anyway, it wasn't just money, it was a pathway to political power. And that brings us to Henry Hastings Sibley. Now, folks, I know that Henry Hastings Sibley is a Minnesota icon. He was your first governor of Minnesota, and the Minnesota Historical Society, as I understand it, I don't know the history well, but he founded this, didn't he? Isn't that correct? Okay. Pardon? Yeah, I'm close to correct anyway. He had a big role in it. And so, I need to remind you in this cynical time that politicians are real human beings. They really are, and they do a lot of things, and some good, some bad. And we shouldn't throw out the good when they do the bad, and we shouldn't throw out the bad when they do the good. We just have to look at them as they are, not as we wish they were. So Henry Hastings Sibley, I'm sure, has done some good things for you, and if he had anything to do with the founding of this wonderful organization, I think that's pretty special. Having said that, at the age of 23, Henry Hastings Sibley became a manager for the American Fur Company in Minnesota. And he represented the fur traders at the Sioux Treaty negotiations in 1851. That treaty granted what they called the Santee Sioux in those days, what we call Dakota, $475,000. And Sibley put in a claim for overpayment. You hear me? Overpayment to the Sioux for furs. Now that's worth, there's some argument about the amount. It may have been $135,000, it may have been $145,000 that he put in for overpayment out of that fund. $145,000 would be roughly $4 million in modern dollars. He got it. Now there's some dispute about whether it made him rich or just paid off his debts. I'm not sure that matters. You can read the biography of him if you want to know more about that. But he got it. That claim was approved by Alexander Ramsey, who was the Indian agent at the time. So Sibley became rich, or at least well off enough to go into politics and become Minnesota's first governor in 1858. And he was succeeded in office by none other than Alexander Ramsey. Now, Congress was central to the system. The Indian agents were appointed on recommendation of congressmen. When Lincoln took office, he had his aides send blank appointment forms to the congressmen in states, particularly the senators, where native peoples resigned. So I have to tell you a little bit about Kansas. Senator Samuel C. Pomeroy of Kansas got 90,000 acres of Potawatomi land after helping to negotiate a treaty. He picked up 50,000 acres of Kickapoo land in similar fashion. And my book tells about a scheme that Pomeroy set up to get a quarter of the profits from traders' sales to the Potawatomis. And he told a crony, who was also to get another quarter of that, is, quote, this is what Pomeroy wrote, "This proceeding is recognized here at the Interior Department and is all right," unquote. Sometimes the charges went high in the Lincoln administration, though I never found a direct link to Lincoln himself. When Sac and Fox trust lands were sold in 1864, tracts were purchased by Indian Commissioner William P. Dole, Secretary of the Interior John Usher, the Comptroller of the Currency Hugh McCullough, and John G. Nicolay, Lincoln's personal secretary. An Indian Office report quoted Clear Sky, an aged Chippewa chief who succinctly characterized what the Indian system said to his people. I've debated whether to leave this in the talk or not, but I guess I will. It may be apocryphal. I don't know whether it's by apocryphal. I mean, it may have been somebody, though it was in a report from an Indian superintendent, one of the, who said he heard this said by this old gentleman. Quote, "Damn rascal, plenty here. He steal him horse, he steal him timber, he steal him everything. He make him good business. Many agents come here, sometimes good, sometimes bad, most bad. The agents say, you must not do so. The next one come, he say, you do very foolish. The government not want you to do so. Agent, much damn rascal. Indian, much damn fool." I apologize for the broken English, and again, I don't know whether I vouch for that or not, but I found it in a document that was supposed to be official. Well, the Indian Territory. Let's talk about the Indian Territory is what is now Oklahoma. We in Kansas still kind of think it's an alien land, but anyway, So immediately, when the war began, I have a daughter who lives in Oklahoma, so I have to be careful since she's not here. Immediately when the war began, some argued that the Indian Territory was inhabited by the so-called 5 civilized tribes was strategically important. It could be a base for attacks on Arkansas and Kansas. Nevertheless, Lincoln chose initially to abandon the Indian Territory as strategically not important to the Civil War. But then the Confederacy organized the territory into a separate military department, and Lincoln's decision began to look like a blunder. The Confederates were organizing Indian troops, and in response, Lincoln reversed himself. And beyond Commissioner Dole, the man who was responsible, if you want somebody equivalent to Sibley or Ramsey, maybe even much, much worse, that was Kansas Senator James H. Bloody Jim Lane. That's what everybody called him. He earned the name for good reason. Lane was a colorful, unscrupulous character who had a tricolored brigade of blacks, Indians, and drifters who plundered places in lots of places around the territory, and is alleged to have plundered Unionist civilians about as readily as the Confederates. Lane came from Indiana, where he had been vilified and practically run out of the state for his escapades. But he provided bodyguards for Abraham Lincoln when he first went to Washington. His Jayhawkers, they called them. We still call that the KU Jayhawkers. The Jayhawkers slept in the White House hallways following the Battle of Fort Sumter and guarded Lincoln against assassination. And Lincoln was not comfortable with Lane, but what politicians have to do sometimes. He said of Lane, quote, "He knocks at my door every morning. He's a very persistent fellow and hard to put off." Jim Lane's obsession was to lead an expedition to shorten the war by attacking the exposed flank of the Confederacy in Arkansas and Texas by way of the Indian Territory. And besides that, there was a flood of native refugees coming into Kansas from the territory, and Kansans didn't want those hungry, dependent Indians in their midst. So the need to return the refugees dovetailed with the need for troops to retake the Indian territories. So in December 1861, the decision was made to it's a historic decision, to take 4,000 Indians into the Army who would receive pay and benefits equal to that of white troops. This is the high point of this whole disastrous adventure. From then on, it goes from bad to worse. William Dole negotiated a bargain whereby Jim Lane would command the troops for the expedition, but be under the overall authority of General David Hunter. Now, Hunter was furious about this, and he bombarded Lincoln with angry letters. Anyway, Lincoln's bargain unraveled. Hunter proclaimed that he, not Lane, would lead the expedition, so Jim Lane torpedoed the expedition project unless he personally himself could command about 30,000 troops. Lincoln lost his temper, understandably, with both men. On January 31st, 1862, he instructed the Secretary of War, and this is classic Lincoln language, "It is my wish," he said, "that the expedition commonly called the Lane Expedition should be as much as has been promised and nothing more. I have not intended and do not now intend that it shall be a great exhausting affair, but a snug, sober column of 10,000 or 15,000. General Lane has been told by me many times that he is under the command of General Hunter and ascended to it as often as told. It was the distinct agreement between him and me when I appointed him that he was to be under Hunter. Well, Jim Lane was not ready to settle for that. So the House of Representatives, at his behest, passed a resolution urging Lincoln to appoint Lane to head the expedition, and newspapers like the Chicago Tribune in his home state criticized Lincoln. And Lincoln, frustrated, told Hunter and gave Hunter and Lane an ultimatum. They had one more chance to work it out. Lane tried to persuade Hunter to let him command, but Hunter refused. So Lane left Kansas to return to his Senate seat in Washington and is reported to have muttered all the way about the man in the White House being, quote, a damned liar, a demagogue, and a scoundrel, unquote. Meanwhile, Lincoln had decided to transfer David Hunter and put Kansas under another department, and the Indian Territory expedition was canceled. Now, however, in what is still a mystery, that persistent fellow, Jim Lane, managed to convince Lincoln to restore the Department of Kansas and place Lane's man, General James G. If I've lost you, I'm sorry. We'll get out of this morass in a moment or two. To place Lane's man, General James G. Blunt, in command. So Lincoln reversed himself again on the expedition. And a factor in this was the Confederacy's use of Indian troops in the Battle of Pea Ridge in Arkansas in March. And a second factor, perhaps even more important, that there were now 7,600 starving Indian refugees in Kansas. I would just add that this is a constant theme on the frontier of starving people. And I would remind all of us that these were not just starving warriors, women, children, and old folks. And throughout the West, this starvation theme, and it becomes paramount when we get to Minnesota, is constant and well documented. There simply is no question about it. So Lincoln authorized 5,000 Indians to be armed to be used only against Indians or in defense of their own territory and homes. This is far less than the grand scheme that Jim Lane wanted to use to turn the tide for the war for the Union. And of course, Jim Lane no longer wanted to command it. But the expedition was launched on June 28, 1862, under the command of Colonel William Weir, that's W-E-E-R. It included 2,000 whites and 3,000 Indians, and initially the expedition encountered little resistance. Unionist Indians, including Cherokee leader John Ross, welcomed them. There were a lot of pro-Union folks there in the territory. However, on July 18th, the white soldiers mutinied against Weir, mutinied because they didn't like to fight with Indians, and the expedition retreated to Kansas. Once again, the expedition was canceled. John Ross, the Cherokee chief, went to see Lincoln in person in September 1862 to plead for help for the refugees. And Lincoln told Ross that, quote, a multitude of cares, unquote, had prevented him from doing anything. And Lincoln certainly did have a multitude of cares. Indeed, it was a time, the war was not going well for the Union. We forget, we so often think that everything is inevitable. Once something happens in history, we assume it's inevitable we would have won World War II. We assume it's inevitable the North would have won the Civil War. We look backwards and say, well, of course, it was. Well, it wasn't. And it wasn't inevitable to Abraham Lincoln in 1862. They were in serious difficulty. It wasn't until almost 1864 that the tide finally turned. So once again, the expedition was canceled. Lincoln eventually capitulated to Lane. In 1864, Jim Lane passed a bill through Congress to remove the Indians from Kansas and, in the process, extinguish title to lands belonging to native tribes, which the senator openly admitted, quote, occupy central positions, holding large tracts of productive country in the very heart of our state, unquote. And he called this removal, quote, an act of justice to the Indians and the people of Kansas, unquote. So in June, 5,000 refugees were taken to the Indian Territory, too late to plant crops, and so they endured even more suffering. Lincoln authorized $200,000 for clothing and food and asked Congress to appropriate the money after the fact. In short, Lincoln's indecisive policies toward the Southern tribes only made the situation worse. He failed to exploit any potential military advantage in the region, and the results for the Indian refugees were disastrous. But I'm sure in a sophisticated audience like this, I know there's some Civil War buffs out there somewhere who know probably more than I do about where the big war was at this point. You have to understand that Lincoln was dealing with a lot of stuff, and what was going on in Kansas was on the back burner. Well, let's get to Minnesota. The war there broke out on August 17th, 1862, when in an incident near Acton, some settlers were killed by braves seeking food. And the Dakotas, particularly Little Crow, fearing a reprisal, launched what could be called a preventive war. That's debatable, I think. I think we can get deeper into that. We'll talk about the causes when we can, because as I understand what the history that you've mostly had before has talked about the war and its aftermath, but not much about the causes. This could not have come at a worse time for Lincoln. His army was short of manpower. His main generals were bickering. On August 29th and 30th, the Union forces under General John Pope were defeated at Second Bull Run, and an outraged Pope, this is P-O-P-E, General John Pope, blamed General McClellan, his superior, for that defeat. And the Lincoln administration, with the news from Minnesota, it seems incredible to us, but they feared that it was indeed a Confederate conspiracy, particularly given what had happened in Kansas and the Indian Territory. And he had reports of Indian raids allegedly all the way from Minnesota to Pikes Peak. Wasn't true, but these reports came in. Lincoln's own secretary, John Nicolay, was in Minnesota and reported, quote, a wild panic prevails in nearly half the state. Caleb Smith, the Secretary of the Interior, blamed the war on the insurrection in the southern states, and even Lincoln voiced to Congress fears that, quote, that a simultaneous attack was to be made upon white settlements by all the tribes between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains, unquote. This is the context in which Lincoln ordered Governor Ramsey to attend to the Indians. I just mentioned I'm not going to take a lot of time for it, but gee, I've talked longer than I think this played a role in taking black troops into the Union Army, but that's a subject that's explored in the book and the coinciding of these things. But I think I've been ad-libbing too much, Danielle, so I'll move along. Lincoln decided to separate his quarrelsome generals, Pope and McClellan. He organized a new military department in the Northwest, as Minnesota was called in those days, and General John Pope, who was agitating against McClellan, would be sent to prosecute that war. Now, Pope felt like he was being banished, and in a sense he was, but he got over it quickly, and arriving in Minnesota in mid-September, he joined forces with who else? Colonel Henry Hastings Sibley. And Pope announced that he would launch a campaign that would, quote, utterly exterminate the Sioux, unquote. I call your attention to that word, exterminate. You know, there'll probably be some World War II vets here, at least the sons and daughters of World War II vets. Did you ever hear anybody talk about exterminating the Germans or the Japanese? Well, you probably did somewhere. But no, for a top general to talk about extermination, that term comes up again and again. And again, I would point out to you, when we talk extermination, we're not talking about just warriors. We're talking about women, children, and old folks. Pope predicted that the whole of Minnesota, west of the Mississippi, and the territories of Dakota and Nebraska would be entirely depopulated. Now, the war didn't last long. It was over by October, but it's not going to be over for Abraham Lincoln or the Dakotas. Pope ended up with 1,500 to 1,600 prisoners, mostly women and children, over at Fort Snelling, I believe they were, left for that time. He set up a military commission under Sibley to try the male combatants. And Pope and Sibley announced early on they quite simply intended to execute all the men who were tried and convicted. By now, Abraham Lincoln's cabinet members were getting worried. One cabinet member worried that this was about Winnebago land that Minnesotans wanted. On October 17th, Pope informed Sibley, quote, The president directs that no executions be made without his sanction, unquote. Lincoln understood that this was a developing situation that was dangerous. On November 8th, 1862, Lincoln received a list of 303 Dakota men who were condemned to death. 2 days later, Lincoln wired Pope asking for the complete trial records and evidence showing distinctions as to guilt. Pope's response was, quote, "The only distinction between the culprits is to which of them murdered most people or violated most young girls," unquote. It's another one of these rhetorical things that's all through this system is the preoccupation with rape, which I guess has come back into American politics a little bit. There's something about that, and we can talk about it in Q&A if you want me to play amateur psychologist with you about it. But anyway, Pope warned that there would be, of course there were rapes, okay? There were awful things that happened on both sides. That's not the question. But Pope warned that there would be mob action in Minnesota if the men were not executed. Lincoln and his lawyers were horrified at what they found in the trial records. I've read those trial records. I cringed at them. They lasted 10 to 15 minutes with little evidence. Lincoln's lawyers labored for a month on them. Finally, a public roar ensued, and Lincoln was lobbied from every quarter to go ahead and order the executions or let the people on the ground do it. Lincoln was tempted. He was tempted to pass the buck. But the judge advocate told him when he asked on December 1st that the President of the United States could not do that legally. Lincoln decided that despite the lack of evidence, this is the harsh decision, he decided there had to be a blood sacrifice. And he decided to execute 39 of the 303. He later reported to Congress, quote, "Anxious to not act with so much clemency as to encourage another outbreak on one hand, nor with so much severity as to be real cruelty on the other, I ordered a careful examination of the records of the trials to be made in view of first ordering the execution of such as has been proved guilty of violating females," unquote. In that statement, Lincoln tried to appease almost everyone. He found only 2 Dakotas guilty of rape, and further attempted to distinguish those who had participated in massacres from those who had only taken place in battles. Lincoln remained involved, and when you look at what he was dealing with, it's remarkable how involved he made. He had his secretary caution Sibley about 2 prisoners whose names were similar. Lincoln pardoned 1 additional prisoner, so that's how we get to 38, reducing the final execution. However, 1 prisoner was executed by mistake. Mr. Berg's book talks about that in some detail. The important thing is the 38, the president authorized the largest official mass execution in American history. Lincoln's actions had a price. He reduced the execution list, but he struck a bargain with the Minnesotans. He agreed to continue the incarceration of the Dakotas not executed. The government paid the cost of the Indian War and compensated Minnesotans for damages. Lincoln acquiesced in the removal of both Dakota and Ho-Chunks, even though the Ho-Chunks had nothing to do with the war. In other words, Lincoln traded lives for land and money. He also permitted a series of military raids against Indians in the region during the rest of the war. And he turned his attention back to the war for the Union. In 1863, Alexander Ramsey asked him about the leftover prisoners, and Lincoln said, quote, "It was a disagreeable subject." But he would take it up and dispose of it. And of the 329 prisoners at Mankato, Lincoln pardoned 26 more. And he ordered 1 native Big Eagle to be released and found out weeks later that his order had been ignored. Lincoln never released the rest of the prisoners. Their prison conditions were awful. Another 67 died in those conditions, almost twice the number executed. In addition, Sibley had those 1,600 women and children in custody, and they were afflicted by disease. And when they were moved to Dakota Territory in 1863, it was too late to plant crops, and starvation and disease were once again rampant. This is a tough story. Following the 1864 election, Alexander Ramsey visited the White House and talked politics with Lincoln. Lincoln noted that he carried Minnesota only by 7,000 votes compared to 10,000 in 1860. And Ramsey responded that, quote, if he had hung, this is from Ramsey's diary, if he had hung more Indians, we should have given him his old majority, unquote. Lincoln failed to see the humor of that remark. I could not afford to hang men for votes, he said. Well, let's talk about Lincoln and the reformers for a few moments. I'm running longer than I expected, so I'll try to do this fairly quickly. The convergence of Indian affairs and the Indian troubles in the Indian Territory and in Minnesota gave reformers a chance to get the president's ear on reform of the Indian system. The key leader who did that was Bishop Henry Whipple, the Episcopal bishop from Minnesota. And when the Minnesota Indian War broke out, Whipple seized the opportunity to lobby Lincoln in Washington. Whipple blamed the problems, including the Minnesota War, on the Indian system. And the core of his proposal was to take the politics out of the system, get rid of the patronage process. He wanted appointees who were, quote, men of inflexible integrity, of large heart, of clear head, of strong will, who fear God and love man. In short, they should be above the reach of political demagogues. Of course, Whipple made this proposal to depoliticize the system to a man who had been a lifelong politician. Whipple described to Lincoln the corruption of the agents, the lack of government protection, and the war that arose from it. And Whipple believed that Lincoln was deeply moved. And when Whipple visited him on September 16th, 1862, right in the middle of the Dakota War, and Lincoln told a friend that Bishop Whipple, quote, came here the other day and talked with me about the rascality of this Indian business until I felt it down to my boots. And I'm sure some of your interest is, you've probably seen the Spielberg movie on Lincoln, and if you want to talk about it in Q&A, I'm glad to. I've seen it too. I think it's really quite good, even though they invent some dialogue and all that didn't really happen. But in that movie, you will see Lincoln the storyteller, and he was always telling stories. And I think most of the time he would tell a story like this to get off a hot issue. And he had these enigmatic stories that you could never quite figure out what they meant. But somehow when he got done, he diffused it. And so here is Bishop Whipple pressing him on this. And he tells this story. He says, Bishop, a man thought that monkeys could pick cotton better than Negroes because they were quicker and their fingers smaller. He turned a lot of them into his cotton field, but he found that it took 2 overseers to watch 1 monkey. It needs more than 1 honest man to watch 1 Indian agent. I think I know what he meant, but the more I think about it, I'm not sure. Anyway, maybe Lincoln thought he was the one honest man. Lincoln did say, according to Whipple, at the end of that conference, quote, if we, 2 ifs, 2 big ifs, if we get through this war and I live, this Indian system shall be reformed. And in his annual message to Congress, Lincoln asked Congress to reform the Indian system, although his recommendation was vague. He pointedly did not mention the cornerstone of Whipple's program, which was to take politics out of it. And it was the congressman to whom Lincoln spoke who profited most from the system and controlled its patronage. The tide turned in the war for the Union, and Lincoln did not stay focused on reform. Still, in his 1863 message, he proclaimed, quote, the urgent need for immediate legislative action. However, more important in that message was Lincoln's expansive vision for the development of the West, including removing Indians from lands and developing mining and railroads. And Commissioner Dole revealed that the government had settled on a harsh Indian policy of concentration. Quote, the plan, this is Dole, the plan of concentrating Indians and confining them to reservations may be regarded as the fixed policy of the government, unquote. Bishop Whipple, in despair, gave up on Lincoln and supported General McClellan for the presidency in 1864. As the Civil War wound down, Lincoln's policy of concentration drifted toward militarism. Secretary of the Interior Usher said it vividly, quote, This department will make provision for such Indians as will submit to its authority and locate upon the reservation. Those who resist should be pursued by the military and punished, unquote. This is the harsh policy of the government at war. So in New Mexico, General James Carleton's concentration operations resulted in 7,500 starving natives and excessive costs, and particularly notorious in Colorado, Governor John Evans and Colonel John Shivington launched a campaign that culminated in the Sand Creek Massacre, which slaughtered 150 Indians, mostly women and children. There was a public scandal over that massacre that led to a congressional investigation. It produced a report in 1867, but of course that's 2 years after Lincoln was gone. There was a peace policy later that was implemented to some extent under Grant. I wouldn't claim too much for it, but I don't claim to be expert on that, in fact. So what do we do with Abraham Lincoln? Was Lincoln's proposal to reform the system genuine or mere political rhetoric? Well, it's significant he didn't talk about taking politics out of the system. On the other hand, in the midst of the war, he could have chosen to say nothing. If Lincoln was not a radical on reform of the Indian system, he was at least marginally more reformist than most of the congressmen who really controlled the system through their patronage. The War of the Union just took too much of Lincoln's and everyone's energies, and so the reform movement was really doomed. If Lincoln lived, as he prophetically implied to Bishop Whipple, I'm inclined to think he might have supported the proposals that came in 1867, but there's no way to know for sure. Historians still argue about how much of a humanitarian Lincoln was. Certainly, the Minnesota executions speak to us about that. It's remarkable how involved Lincoln became, actually. He could have chosen to do nothing. I have no doubt that they would have hung all 303 Dakota men had he not intervened. So, hey, if it's the glass half full, half empty. On the other hand, the Dakota folks I know say 38, largest official mass execution in history, many of those not justified. Oh, wow. Lincoln perhaps was more humanitarian toward Indians than most of his white contemporaries, but the tenor of the time was to treat Native people as savages. They loved that word. And so if things were wrong, the anti-reform people blamed it on the Indians. And Senator James Doolittle, a progressive senator, one of the most talked about the Indians, he was the head chairman of the Indian Committee in the Senate as a, quote, dying race, giving place to another race with a higher civilization. And Lincoln himself, in spring of 1863, met leaders from several tribes in the East Room of the White House. And he spoke to them, and you have to listen to this. This is a newspaper report. I assume it's accurate. He says, there's a great difference, this is Lincoln, between this pale-faced people and their red brethren, both as to numbers and the way in which they live. He goes on. The pale-faced people are numerous and prosperous because they cultivate the earth, produce bread, depend upon products of the earth rather than wild game for subsistence. This is the chief reason of the difference, but there is another. Although we are now engaged in a great war between one another, we are not, as a race, so much disposed to fight and kill one another as our red brethren. We are not told what went through the minds of the tribal leaders at hearing this perfectly remarkable statement by the President of the United States. And if you look at the bloodiness of the Civil War, listen, folks, the American Civil War was among the bloodiest conflicts in all human history as a race. Well, so what do we do with Lincoln? His shortcomings are evident, but given his situation, I don't know if I'd been in his shoes that I could have done any better. Not much was possible. He listened, recommended reform, saved some lives, and got reelected. The man who would not hang men for votes still corralled the votes he needed to govern. Lincoln was not only a marvelously eloquent, a poet really, man, but a tough guy. My dissertation advisor at William and Mary, who prided, claiming he was an unreconstructed Confederate. I think he played that game a little bit. I talked to him the other day. He's dying with bone cancer. Wonderful guy. But I remember him telling me that from a Southern point of view, when he was helping me put this dissertation together, he said, from a Southern point of view, Lincoln was a mean man. So in Minnesota, he ordered to tend to the Indians and said, necessity knows no law. This was the same president who threw out one general after another until he found one in Ulysses Grant who would shed enough blood to get the job done. Lincoln, for all his personal sensitivity, was a politician, and a very good one, obsessed with one goal. He would use violence to resolve problems with Indians or anyone else who got in the way of his highest priority, which was saving the Union. And as you and I look backward, I don't suspect there's very many of us in the room that think he was wrong about wanting to do that. Thank you. I welcome your questions, including comments that disagree. Thank you.